So before we get into this, one thing that as we were walking this procession, it's important to note that when the procession started, something like there was a 16-gun salute coming from the cemetery. When the procession ended or when the ceremony was over, there was a 32-gun salute at the time. And every minute during the procession, that cannons were going off. So in addition to the controlled chaos during the procession itself, imagine the martial air with soldiers everywhere. It was more than anybody had seen since the Battle of Gettysburg, and with cannons booming and everything like that. It was certainly the most shots. I calculate some 150 to 200 shots that were actually fired during that time. I mean, it would have made an impression. The whole atmosphere would have been alive. There was so much more going on than just the 2 minutes that we remember the most. Tim?
It seems as if the dignitaries reached the platform around 11:15 or 11:20, according to a couple people that give accounts of the ceremonies with time. No one has the same exact time on their watches. I'd imagine at that time there was a dispute about using, setting your clocks back. So, people have a variety of times. But remember that Gary's going to show some photographs, and there's one photograph at least from the window of the gatehouse on the second floor there, looking in this direction. And there's one photograph, and I don't think we brought that today, that's from a house along the Tawnytown Road looking up this way. And we know that Alexander Gardner has a platform or possibly a wagon over there, and his camera is shooting in this way, shooting in this direction. And then there's a platform with a camera over there that takes the very famous photograph, which is you can blow up and perhaps see Lincoln in the photograph. And the Alexander Gardner images over there show Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill in the distance. They show a tent that I'm sure Gary is pointing out in some of his views, which Edward Everett had because he might need to use it just before he goes on and just as he comes off.
Supposedly he can hold it 2 hours. How long is his speech? 2 hours. Visit that tent before you start. Visit that tent after.
And the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse appears in the background of the views. So you can kind of triangulate the views. And as early as the 1940s, Frederick Tilburg, who was a National Park Ranger, had realized that the platform from which Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address could not possibly have been over there. It had to have been somewhere over here. And he wrote a little monograph about the site of the platform. And the pictures pretty much confirm that it's over here. Exactly where the platform is, something that people still argue about to this day, you probably realize. Gary, how big's the platform?
16 by 20?
Yeah, I was going to say, I have here, it's 12 foot by 20, but I don't remember where I got that. So there's maybe even, we don't know what the platform exactly look like or the exact dimensions of it, but it takes up a pretty good piece of ground. And when William Frassinito was working on his book, Early Photography at Gettysburg, he approached it in a way that other people had not approached it before. He approached it by what stones were here at that time and who was buried here with an old stone and who was not. And his general assessment is the platform must be somewhere right here. Roy Frampton, who did his own investigation of where he thought the platform was based on counting the people in the crowd and how much room a person takes up, he did a whole little thing on it. He said that he thought it was right at that obelisk. Yes, good, good, good. And, so, different people have different ideas. If you read Garry Will's book about Lincoln at Gettysburg, that actually did win a Pulitzer Prize, right, Garry?
I think it did.
He says that the platform is over there at the Brown Mausoleum. That there was a large group of rocks there prior to that mausoleum, and he says that the platform was on top of that. That seems like it's a little bit far. And then, as Garry could maybe talk about, the newest guy who did tried to triangulate where the platform is, he tends to think it's a little bit farther over that way, and he has the corner of the platform being out into the National Cemetery. I think the important thing is there's a plaque placed by the War Department near the Lincoln Speech Memorial as you come into the Tonytown Road side of the cemetery, and it says that Lincoln gave the speech from a platform that was erected at the current site of the Soldiers' National Monument. And I think people over the years have realized that the platform was not over there, that the platform was over here in what is now the Evergreen Cemetery. Do you have anything to add to all that?
Yeah, just real quick. It's important to note that even if they wanted to hold it there, they were burying soldiers from the battle. This is something they wanted to do originally after the consecration. It's a consecration after all. Consecration is sort of a beginning, not a dedication. But because Edward Everett couldn't come until November 19th, he couldn't possibly deliver that speech till then, they decided to start burying soldiers right up until 2 days before this dedication, okay? So what that means is, you can see in the first picture I showed you, you can see graves all over in there. So if you have the platform a little further back, there's a chance that the crowd aren't trampling, the newly fresh dug, interments. Again, these are not where they fell. This is where they're being moved to for $1.59 a body, which went to the lowest bidder.
Yeah, the reinterment started in October of 1863, and at the time of the ceremony, about a third of the bodies were moved into the cemetery of the final, 3,500 of them, however many you think there are?
3512.
3512?
Well, at that time.
Okay. So the bodies were reinterred in here into March of 1864. So they continued after the ceremonies, the reburial process. And that's a very fascinating process. So the dignitaries somehow entered the cemetery, like we said, off of the Tonytown Road, came over into this area and mounted the platform. And I mentioned that if all the people were on the platform who claim later that they're on the platform, it's really big. I like Noah's Ark because, Noah's Ark's got to be really big to handle all the different animals that are, on the ark. If you didn't get that, I don't know. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, and this is something I noticed in the accounts when we talk about it, there's some introductory remarks, there's a prayer given, and then there's a sort of a hymn that's sung, and there's a band that plays some music, and then, Edward Everett gets a speech, and there's a dirge that is performed by a choir. When these people perform, it's obvious from their accounts that they are on the stage. So, the platform. So, do they, all walk onto the platform and perform their song, and then all walk off? Because in their accounts, they make it sound as if they're sitting on the platform the entire time. Do the dignitaries step down off of the platform and allow the people that are singing to come up on the platform, and then they go back off and the dignitaries come back up? These are things that I don't think we know. But that's one of the reasons you have so many people standing on the platform, because we're talking about all the singers, a group of singers from Philadelphia, a group of singers from Baltimore, and some local people join in these various performances. According to William Storick, the platform was occupied by those who took part in the exercises, members of the cabinet, governors of some of the states, representatives from some foreign countries, and in addition to these, a few wounded soldiers who had participated here in the battle were on the platform. And he says that most of the faces of the wounded were unrecognizable to him, but one he recognized, Calvin Hamilton, a citizen of Gettysburg who was a member of Company K, 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, was wounded in the charge off of Little Round Top across the Valley of Death into the wheat field on July 2nd. And he is on the platform. I have a picture of him. I should give it to
Yeah, you know, it's always great to tell people what you don't bring with you that they could otherwise see. That's a great idea.
No, I mean, so you can, Chris, so you can find him on the platform.
Ah, okay.
Okay. So, you know, I really like, I think, to compile a list of people who say they're on the platform. So at least we have an idea of how many people we're talking about. Yeah. Emily Souter recalled, a beautiful flag floated over the platform, which was arranged with seats for the distinguished guests. Among the many banners was one which touched every heart with its mute lamentations. A white flag shrouded with black bearing the inscription, "We mourn our fallen comrades of the Army of the Potomac." Isn't that nice? So we know there's a flagpole, and the flagpole in the photographs is a distance away from the platform, and it's been said that the flagpole is about where the Soldiers' National Monument is today. The cornerstone of that monument was dedicated in 1865 in a speech by General Oliver Otis Howard. And the monument itself was completed and dedicated in 1869. Do you know who the speaker was then? George Gordon Meade.
The greatest general
in American history. Good. Very good.
A couple of things about that real quick. So they didn't just say, oh, there's room there for the monument. When the landscape architect, William Saunders, laid this out, it was always thought that the troops, the soldiers buried there, would be in a semicircle, all essentially facing toward a central monument, a monument they didn't get to build and finish till 1869, okay? But as part of all these consecration ceremonies and whatnot, we not only have what was said during the prayer and benediction, what Everett said, what Lincoln said, we also have the 1865 speech of Oliver Otis Howard, which is really cool. Unlike in the Lincoln movie, when, soldiers are reading it back to him and kind of saying, things to him that he's not doing well enough, Howard picks it apart. He talks about that Lincoln and I believe Everett, the lamented speakers from that day who had consecrated the place for the second time, that Lincoln never, gave up on that unfinished work. And he takes the speech and reflects back on it 2 years later. And really invokes a pretty powerful speech about what had happened here. And of course, Howard was right there for a time during the battle. So read these words, it's pretty cool.
Good, very good. I don't know, I got to say, I don't remember reading Howard's dedication cornerstone speach. I'll have to do that.
Well, when people talk about the cornerstone speech, they tend to mean something else. Some of you get that there.
Okay. According to the Adams Sentinel, the platform atop Cemetery Hill was surrounded by at least 20,000 citizens, and several thousand of whom were congregated immediately in front of the stand. The immense crowd, being interspersed with chief marshals, aides, and officers of different grades. Soldiers were placed in behind them to form a circle outside the crowd, congregating near the stand and entirely surrounding it. Beyond that, thousands of citizens clustered in surging masses, endeavoring to get a glimpse and hear what was said. So when they finally took the stand, there was, like I say, words of introduction, probably Word Lamont, and then a dirge was played by the Bergfield Band of Philadelphia. There was a prayer given by Reverend Thomas Stockton, chaplain of the United States Senate. A lot of people make fun of this prayer because they say it's too long. It was a prayer that wanted to be a speech. You see that a lot?
You see that a lot, by the way. Sometimes we have big speakers there on November 19th every year, and sometimes the introduction for those speeches are as long as the speech themselves, so I get it.
There's more music played by the Marine Band. Letters of regret were read by those unable to attend. General Meade was one of those.
Correct.
And then Edward Everett was introduced, and for the next 2 hours, he gave an elaborate and somewhat lengthy oration. I think, I mentioned yesterday, I don't know if I mentioned it today, but I've collected accounts from the locals. And when you read the accounts by other dignitaries, they're pretty nice to Edward Everett. But in our local accounts, none of them have anything good to say about Edward Everett's speech. William Stork thought that Everett's address was an able production, but perhaps a little bit too long for the occasion. William Tipton, who was 13 years old, remembered it as a scholarly and masterful speech, but long and tedious. Philip Bickle, who was later a teacher at Gettysburg College, said that the speech had all the fine finish you might expect from such a polished order. But on the whole, it was disappointing as it was given mainly to the movements of the troops that fought at the battle, but he held the crowd together remarkably well. It's interesting that Edward Everett toured the battlefield. He had advanced access to Michael Jacobs' history of the battle, and William Frestenito noted in it, and I had not thought about this, it's one of the first usage of the words Little Round Top in an account after the battle. So he uses that term, because Jacobs uses it and Edward Everett uses it. Jacobs' book doesn't come out until after Edward Everett's speech.
I think it's appropriate to read a little bit of this. I hope you don't mind, Tim. So not only is it one of the first, but it's 13 paragraphs plus the setup. The setup is substantial to get the troops here in the first place, and he provides a pretty good account at the division level of what happened on the Union side. It's very one-sided. And by the way, if you look at these accounts, if you're, really leaning toward, you like the rebels a little bit, reading these speeches ain't for you, okay? This is a time to not only celebrate the Union, but to really put the blame on the South for this war, okay? Now, throughout the war, you don't see that all the time, but in 1863 and 65 at this cemetery, it is very blunt speech. Now, when he's talking, and by the way, I'll note that I know a lot of people who have studied this battle for years and years. Everett had very little time, didn't have the official records, really lacked a lot of what you would have. And I know a lot of people that have been studying for a while that don't know this battle by division. So let's think about, Everett as, an early historian. I'm going to read parts of 2 paragraphs. And now the momentous day, a day to be forever remembered in the annals of the country arrived. Early in the morning on the 1st of July, the conflict began. I need not say that it would be impossible for me to comprise within the limits of the hour such a narrative as would do anything like full justice to the all-important events of these 3 great days, or the merit of the brave officers of men of every rank, of every arm of the service, and every loyal state who bore their part in the tremendous struggle. You see why he's not going to get much in the hour appointed. I mean, even in explaining why he can't, it's longer than the Gettysburg Address. Alike, those who nobly sacrificed their lives for their country and blah, blah, blah. He says, the astonishingly minute, accurate, and graphic accounts contained in the journals of the day, prepared from the personal observation by reporters who witnessed the scenes and often shared the perils they described, and the highly valuable notes of Professor Jacobs of the university of the place. Gettysburg College is still not a university to this day, right? To which I'm gratefully indebted, will abundantly supply the deficiency of my necessarily too condensed statement. General Reynolds, on arriving at Gettysburg on the morning of the 1st, found Buford with his cavalry warmly engaged with the enemy, who he held gallantly in check. Hastening himself to the front, General Reynolds directed his men to be moved over the fields from the Emmitsburg Road in front of McMillan's and Dr. Schmucker's under cover of the Seminary Ridge. Without a moment's hesitation, he attacked the enemy, at the same time sending orders to the 11th Corps, General Howard's, to advance as promptly as possible. General Reynolds immediately found himself engaged with a force which greatly outnumbered his own and had scarcely made his dispositions for the action when he fell, mortally wounded, at the head of his advance. The command of the 1st Corps devolved upon General Doubleday, and that field on General Howard, who arrived at 11:30 with Schurz's and Barlow's division of the 11th Corps. This is pretty good stuff. You can say it's Jacobs, but he did his reading well enough to understand it and to memorize it without really looking at his speech for 2 hours, certainly not during the battle section.
And he was here the day before. It's interesting if he added details the night before the speech to his speech. He was here the day before, or 2 days before, and toured the battlefield with Michael Jacobs. So he got a tour of the battlefield.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing, because the first day takes up about as much room or more room than the second or the third. And it's interesting because when he starts talking about the second, he talks about the Confederate advance, talks about the blunder of the enemy, who gave Meade all day to prepare until 4 p.m. Pretty interesting. We now know about the countermarch and all these other things. They talk about the arrival of the 5th and 6th Corps, but he really focuses on who saved the day. Not Joshua Chamberlain, not Dan Sickles, the Pennsylvania Reserves that claimed so much credit in the newspaper. General Crawford himself working hard to make sure the Pennsylvania Reserves were seen for all that they had done. So early on, this idea of claiming credit, of dashing credit onto your people, of securing Medal of Honor, citations for those within, it makes a difference early on. And when you came here early, you weren't going to see Chamberlain or Vincent or even Warren, the Pennsylvania Reserves, and so it is reflected.
And so that guy sitting on the stand,
Yeah.
he's a Pennsylvania, he's in the reserves.
Yeah, and I wonder if Gibbon's like, hey, like he's there, Doubleday's there.
Yeah,
Hey.
Doubleday and Gibbon, yeah. And Robert Schenck of Baltimore. I don't like Robert Schenck, by the way. Here's something interesting from a guy named Junius Remsnyder, a student of the Lutheran Seminary. And he had actually entered the Army in 1862, had been discharged, but he, for a time, was in the 131st Pennsylvania, was present at the Battle of Antietam. And he mentions about Everett, let's see, Lincoln sat upon a rude wooden rocking chair, which from the disproportionate length of the back seemed to have been specially prepared for him. Let's see, where is it? The address of Edward Everett was very elaborately prepared. Nevertheless, it had, I think, the serious defect of too rigid formality and too great length. He used no notes, and his address was evidently memorized. It occupied about 2 hours in delivery. The day had grown quite warm, and the great multitude was becoming restless. So eventually, the speech ended. But one thing that happened during the speech, according to a story, I think, Gary, I got it out of the history of the Smizer family.
I have 5 copies of that at home.
So Catherine
Good. I'm glad you
Smizer
understand I was
Wills. This is the genealogy of Catherine Wills' family. And they have a section on their family coming to Gettysburg for the Gettysburg Address. And one story relates that during Edward Everett's speech, there was a flurry in the crowd in the Smizer party when Anna Capetto, a cousin from Baltimore, pretended to faint so she could be carried to a seat on the platform. That's just not right.
You know, we have accounts too of a little boy underneath the platform, you know, kids being kids trying to get closer. And little kids are great at getting through the crowd, you know, and whatnot. It's just fascinating. And everybody wrote about it later.
It is. Following Edward Everett's address, a hymn composed for the occasion by the Reverend Benjamin French was sang by the Baltimore Glee Club. And then came the moment which everybody had awaited. Ward Lamont, chief or layman, chief marshal of the ceremonies, and the presidential bodyguard stepped forward to announce the President of the United States. Jacob Polk remembered that Lincoln arose and amidst the thunder of artillery, you know, they're firing cannons again, and the tremendous applause of the immense multitude advanced to the front of the platform, his tall, gaunt form and sad but amiable face within the view of thousands who beheld that memorable scene. When silence was secured, he proceeded in slow and measured tones to deliver his dedicatory address. His words were not heard by the larger majority of the people present, but during his address, the most profound silence was observed. When he uttered the closing words, which had become immortal, emphasizing each sentence with a brief pause and a significant nodding and jerking of his head, that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. It occurred to me, for I stood within a few feet of him and heard all he said, that I had never heard or read anything like them, and that they were destined to be an imperishable immortality in the hearts of the American people. So there's a lot of different accounts, but I really like Jacob Polk's account from Chambersburg, and it's given in his book called The Great Invasion.
Great book, by the way.
We have lots of accounts of it.
I'm sure it's not lost on us that he said, and the hushed silence fell over before Lincoln's speech. We got a tour there, we got the ambulances, so we didn't plan this well enough.
Oh, good. Park ranger. Earlier in the ceremonies, Daniel Skelly. Do you remember Daniel Skelly? His brother, Jack Skelly, was Jenny Wade's boyfriend, and he was wounded on June 15th, died on July 13th. Daniel Skelly in 1864 would go to Winchester, recover Skelly's body, and Jack Skelly's buried just right over there. Jenny Wade is buried here. I should mention David McConaughey is buried right over there that we talked about today. Schmucker, who's mentioned in Edward Everett's speech, is the vice president of the cemetery at the time of the dedication, and he's buried right there where the white obelisk is located. So a bunch of these people are buried right around us. Michael Jacobs, who helped Edward Everett, is buried just over there. So, you know, it's fascinating. It must be fascinating for the people in the crowd listening to this address, knowing that, you know, their plots are right at the same site where this address is being given. According to Daniel Skelly, he climbed up on the side of the platform with my feet on the floor of it, my left arm over the railing. So there must be a railing on the backside of the platform. I was too young to judge the character of Lincoln's brief speech, but what impressed me most was its delivery. The words seemed to come from the soul of the man, from a heart torn by anguish. He spoke in a quiet, forceful, and earnest manner, with no attempt at oratory.
Oratory.
Yeah, oratory. And as I remember, it was received with very little applause. It was the earnest manner of its delivery that impressed me as a boy. And the scene with all its accompaniments marked itself so unmistakably, I'm having
It's
trouble.
getting late in the day, folks.
Unmistakably on my mind that I'd never forgotten it. And we do have interesting details that are given by some of the citizens. William Tipton gives a couple details. The president looked sadly over the cemetery and after a pause began his famous speech in a sad voice entirely devoid of zeal and fire, which had characterized Mr. Edward Everett's address. So far as Tipton could remember, Lincoln used only one gesture during his entire speech, a wave of the hand when he came to the sentence that these honored dead shall not have died in vain. And again, William Tipton would live till 1929, and he remembered every aspect of Lincoln's visit for the rest of his life and gave these details whenever he was asked. So we have a bunch of interviews with him.
So a few things. First of all, to connect something Tim had said earlier about Lincoln's supposed tour of the battlefield, okay? It seems unbelievable that he could have done this. A, he didn't have enough time. There is no time. B, how could he have left the Wills house, gone and came back without a single person mentioning it? He didn't go anywhere here without people talking about it, without reporters and everything like that. There was a throng, even in the morning, outside his house. So it just doesn't seem right. But part of Tim's theory is, and what some of the scholars, Lincoln scholars who support that he toured the battlefield, want him to have been moved by the occasion. He delivered the address so well, so forcefully, so somberly, because he had seen the battlefield. And if you start to believe that, then he saw the battlefield because he was going to see where his friend Reynolds was killed, and we don't even know, if they were buddies. We particularly, think that they probably weren't. That's one thing. Two, we can go, and you can go and read any number of books and watch any number of videos, listen to any number of podcasts about the speech itself, okay? You have your own feelings about it. You have your favorite lines. All of us could probably do the whole thing with a couple of mistakes, and some of y'all could do the whole thing without any problem, okay? For my part, I would look up how Doug Dowds summarizes it. He's a battlefield guide here, and he just he used to be a speechwriter, and he put some deep thought into it. And he sort of does a few things. One, he talks about accurately how the speech starts in the past, 7 years ago, comes to the present, now we are met on a great battlefield, and then takes you to the future of what this government, is going to be. That at the same time he's going through 3 time periods, he is also serving as a citizen like everybody else in the crowd, and then as commander-in-chief for the military aspects of it, and then as the president, where he is really setting the tone for the, forward course of the country. And at the same time, he's making these things happen by using 1/10 or more of the 272 words on the word here and on collective pronouns like we and our. Okay, that's more than 1/10 of the words. If you throw in a few other things like that, it's half the speech, mostly one-syllable words. So I'd encourage you to Google or to YouTube what Doug Dowds has to say about it. In 5 or 10 minutes, you'll get an approach a lot quicker than you're going to get in a lot of the books, and in my opinion, with a lot less speculation than you get in a lot of the books. I also recommend the Battle of Gettysburg podcast and Addressing Gettysburg podcast, where you can get guests who have put some thought into this. You might not agree with them. It's perfectly okay. One more thing before I hand it back to Tim. Tim referenced this idea of the location of the platform. I mean, because this is Gettysburg, and because for Gettysburg, this is one of my 5 reasons why Gettysburg is, for many of us, the battlefield. Why it gets the most visitation. Why it's the Kentucky Derby of all Civil War battlefields. And to me, it's, most casualties, near population center, first one to be preserved. I'm looking at the land that comprised the first 4 acres right past the gatehouse there, near, well photographed early on, and Gettysburg Address. Okay, and these things all conspired to make this the Mecca for many people. I still don't know why I'm so obsessed with the place, but it has to do with some of those things. And because of that, everybody, you know, did General Reynolds die here or there? Okay, it gets down to a minute level, and the location of the platform is no exception. Okay, so an acquaintance of ours, I'd call him a friend, Christopher Oakley, who's in town right now. He might be listening somewhere behind one of those headstones. You came up with this idea of taking Frazanito's work farther. By the time Frazanito did his work, we had a picture from the gatehouse. You can see the camera in one of the blow-ups of the other pictures, so we know exactly where that is. And in that picture, you can see sort of a platform that I believe Alexander Gardner used to shoot some of the pictures back in this direction. You've got 3 of those. And then you've got a picture from sort of over there looking this way, and then you've got one from the Duttera house over there looking this way. And it should allow for triangulation. Now, Oakley, a former animator at Disney and a GIS kind of guy, started setting up the known things and then making assumptions about exactly where Gardner's platform was. And where at the Duttera house was that picture taken? On which floor, from which window, and what did that house look like? We don't have exact measurements of how high it is, so he makes assumptions as to this. This is nothing I don't say to him, by the way. This is what historians do. We are supposed to talk to one another. Even as parts of the country don't want to talk to one another about certain things, historians are supposed to argue about this. All we're saying is interpretation, right? We're crafting a story based on what we know. So he talks about the assumptions he makes, but when he calls the New York Times, there are no more assumptions. And all of a sudden, one, I know that the platform is trapezoidal, not rectangular, he says, which I find very interesting, and I tend to buy his argument, okay? And 2, the platform is not simply facing this way, rather it is askew and tilted off a little bit in that direction so that some of it sticks into what is now the National Cemetery, and therefore, all the people early on who said it was near the Soldiers' National Monument were kind of right. And all these other historians that Tim mentioned, Roy Frampton, William Frazanito, Fred Tilburg, that place it entirely in here are kind of wrong. And this thing made a splash, made it to the New York Times, okay? I got quoted in it as the naysayer among a sea of people supporting it, okay? And, you know, basically his theory places the platform right where Frazanito places it, except askew and of a slightly different shape, okay? And what I said in my article, and what Tim will say with greater ferocity, is, oh my God, what does it matter? It's the same place, okay? So that a small percentage of it sticks into the cemetery doesn't change anything about my opinion of it. So Tim said I would talk about this. I do think it's sort of a so what moment, but I find the work fascinating. If the platform is of a different shape, I find that very interesting because that might help us. And by the way, he's constructed a full 3D animation of it, which is cool to look at. You know, I would encourage you to do that. And then it might help us understand how the chairs are arranged and how Lincoln went up. So I think it's worthwhile work. New York Times, article, front page worthy. Tim, what do you think?
Oh, I didn't really want to talk about him.
Oh, yesterday you were all over it.
Yeah.
Well, Tim thinks no.
No, I guess my thing is that we, you know, maybe you mentioned we have historians and we have a process we go through. We don't always get along, or we talk about things and we argue about things and stuff like that. But I don't think, I would say that he purposely put the corner of the platform into the National Cemetery so he could say, hey, I discovered something different.
See,
because what was he going to say? Yeah, I did all this work and I found out that you guys were right. It's right where you said it was.
well, and it is interesting, you know. Again, I think his egregious thing, and it's tempting not to do it. Any of us who have, you know, you want something to be true enough, you know, talk about this with Civil War photography. Oh, I want it to be true. I really do. So isn't it tempting to not quite broadcast that you made certain assumptions about where that platform is and how tall the Duttera house is? That's not terribly interesting to a reporter, but that's what you say first. Okay, you have to talk about what the problems with your theories are, or else people like us are going to stand on the side of the platform and hit you with it.
Yeah. But again, you know, here it doesn't really matter to me, I guess, in that one thing I am curious about is which way Lincoln is facing when he gives the address. So is he here looking this way? You know, we know that camera's over there and he's kind of looking at it.
Oh, it's
so
over there, yeah, okay. Yeah, the back rack camera, I forgot about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. Now, Oakley's work, if it has value and if because I think he's close no matter what, and Fresnillo's close, but if he tips it that way, suddenly Lincoln is looking toward town. And by the way, from up on the platform, because it's raised a few feet.
3 feet.
3 feet.
3 feet.
So that also helps you with the headstones and whatnot. You know, he's looking at Culp's Hill to his right. He could turn around behind him and see the round tops. Even if not close up, he's seeing the battlefield from its most, you know, what's thought as its most dominant position. So I encourage you to do that when you're on the battlefield, of course. Close your eyes for a second, put yourself in somebody else's, you know, mind to the degree that you can or want to, and picture this place, because it's doable.
So I have a few thoughts and, you know, my conclusions or thoughts, and you can chime in if you want. You know, like we said, there are between 15 and 30,000 people in attendance at the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery. A very large portion of them are from Adams County. Most of the people didn't come by, you know, train. Most of the people came by carriage. Most of the people are probably locals. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln runs for re-election against General George Brenton McClellan. McClellan carries Adams County. Did you know that? Artillery fire. Garry showed that one photograph yesterday. Did you show it today, Garry?
What's that?
The one looking over there at the cannons?
I did. Well, I didn't really show the close-up of the cannons.
But there are cannons right over there on Cemetery Hill. A 16-round salute is fired at 7 a.m. What does that do to the people who've been drinking all night and are sleeping in the square? Guns were fired once a minute during the procession. Garry already said this. After the ceremonies, after the speeches end, the artillery fires a 32-round salute. This would be loud. The 5th New York Artillery from Fort McHenry was here, and I think maybe the 5th United States Artillery. There are pickpockets during the ceremony. There are several articles where they catch pickpockets in the crowd, and they, you know, they're going through the crowd taking money from people. There are souvenirs being sold in the crowd at the cemetery. Bullets and artillery shells. Shop windows are full with bullets and shells for sale. Shells sell for 25 cents each to $1.50 on the expensive side.
Depending on if they're disarmed or not.
Samuel Weaver is somewhere in the crowd or in Gettysburg selling photographs with soldiers who are pretending they are dead at Devil's Den in the crowd. I've even seen one example that's listed that, you know, it's sold in the crowd, or they bought it that day.
Wow.
John Burns is in the crowd selling photographs of himself. And I know that because it's in the newspaper. Lancaster Evening Express states, John Burns was overwhelmed with visitors during the recent ceremonies attending the dedication of the National Cemetery and did quite a thriving business in the sale of photographic views of himself.
Do you have one?
Do I have one he sold here? No.
But you do have a Burns CDV.
I do have Burns CDVs.
And let me note, you know, by the way, if that seems tasteless, you know, what if y'all went to a big dedication and saw like one of your heroes? You take a selfie, you ask for their autograph. You know, now selfies and autographs can be free, so it's a little bit different than selling, but they didn't have the option, and I don't know if he could really write.
The Tyson brothers had made a CDV of Jenny Wade, and Jenny Wade's CDV is being sold to visitors that day. There's a lot of things I could say. One of the things that's interesting is there's an article I found in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And again, Gary and I think, talked about this a few times. We like to go onto newspapers.com, put in keyword searches in the engine, and looking in November 1863 at all the available newspapers in the area is something I really like to do. And the Cleveland Plain Dealer correspondent, I think he's drunk. Here's just a sample of what he says. Gettysburg seems absolutely plethoric in pretty girls, fairly rivaling Cleveland in that respect.
Yeah.
We never saw as many fine-looking women in a small place in our entire life before. Whether or not the beaux are equal to the supply of the fair ones, we cannot say. If they are not, we advise all young men of means and leisure of Cleveland to visit Gettysburg and pick out a wife at once.
And by the way, there was an address that day too.
This is in his description of the Gettysburg Address.
Anyone here from Cleveland?
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't been to Cleveland in a while.
There's going to be a total eclipse there on April 8th.
And
Yeah. No, the whole strip. But it's one of the cities in it.
the last thing I wanted to say was Lincoln didn't feel well when he was on the train back to Washington, and doctors quarantined him on the morning of November 20th and diagnosed him with a small case of smallpox. So
Yeah.
he's, all the people he met and shook hands with, I'm sure he's spreading.
Go ahead.
It's a super spreader event.
It's like he's at Sturgis.
Okay, so I think we ended on the time we wanted
I think
to.
so. I think so. I want to encourage all, if you want to stand there and do what you can picture it and everything like that, but the Trust has a free app, the Gettysburg AR app. Mine's, of course, not updated right now, or I'd show it to you, but you can stand over there and place Lincoln and hear what I think is a good rendition by our friend Doug Adelman giving the address, and you can see him standing up there and moving and walk through some of the crowd and whatnot, and you can use it around the battlefield too, so I wanted to say that. I think we will take some questions offline or separate, but before that, Tim, everybody, thank you so much for coming out to our little tour, and thanks to the Adams County Historical Society for setting this up, as well as to the Dobbin House, the Nerd Herd, the Presbyterian Church, not the Lower Marsh Creek Presbyterian Church. Not the Upper Marsh Creek Presbyterian Church.
No, it is the upper.
Oh, it is the Upper? Oh,
Yeah.
God.
Not the United Presbyterian
Not the United
Church.
Presbyterian Church. So thanks to them and everybody who helped. And y'all, this has been a lot of fun. We're here for questions if you have them, and we hope you have a meaningful Remembrance Day.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.